Welcome, everybody, to the Remembrance Month virtual lecture series. My name is Meredith Patterson, and I'll be kind of the facilitator of it, helping Michael on with his presentation and everything like that. As I said, this is recorded, so you can kind of check this out in about a week if you'd like to see it online. And we do have a question and answer period at the end, so if you have any questions, please leave those to the end. Now, I'm actually going to start the presentation off with our land acknowledgement. So the County of Simcoe acknowledges that the land on which we gather today is the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe Nation, which includes the Ojibwe, Ottawa, and Potawatomi nations, sorry about that, collectively known as the Three Fires Confederacy. We also recognize the Huron-Wendat, who occupied these lands prior to the middle of the 17th century. We embrace the enduring presence and partnership of the Indigenous peoples of this region, including the Chippewa Tri-Council First Nations comprised of the Bosley First Nations, the Chippewa of Rama, and the Georgina Island First Nations. We would also like to recognize the diverse Métis and Inuit communities within our region. The County of Simcoe is dedicated to honoring our Indigenous history and culture and is committing to coming together to learn, heal, and create future prosperity, respect, and understanding in all of our communities. Now that we've done our land acknowledgement, I'd like to introduce our presenter today. So Michael Moir is an activist with York University Libraries. He's not an activist, sorry. Michael Moir, he might be, I don't know. Michael Moir is an archivist with York University Libraries, where he was the head of the Clara Thomas Archives and the Special Collections for 20 years. He began his career as an archivist with the Toronto Harbour Commission, which sparked an interest in maritime history. He has published on harbor management and shipbuilding, and is past president of the Canadian Nautical Research Society. So I will now pass it on to the archivist and not activist, Michael Moir. So thank you, Michael.
Thank you very much, Meredith. I'm just going to click to switch screen now. And if people could confirm that you can see the title screen. Excellent. Thank you, Meredith. And we'll get this show on the road. So good afternoon, everyone. And thank you for joining me for a discussion of the transition from wooden to steel shipbuilding in Collingwood. Some of you may recall that 3 years ago, I made a presentation on steel ships for saltwater service, shipbuilding at Collingwood during 2 world wars as part of the Simcoe County Museum's Remembrance Month series. Today, I would like to talk about the origin story. This is sort of like the Marvel universe of shipbuilding in Collingwood and the initiatives that prepared the shipyard to undertake significant programs of merchant and naval vessel construction during 2 world wars. The research today was undertaken at the Collingwood Museum and Library and Archives Canada in Ottawa, thanks to the generous funding support of York University. And I would also like to acknowledge my research assistants for this project, Matthew Alexander and Isabel Blake. The area, now known as Collingwood, offered a natural harbor sheltered by offshore islands, the hen and chickens that gave the town its original name, and a reef. Commercial interests in Toronto, anxious to connect their city with the Upper Lakes, selected this location for a rail terminus that would connect with waterborne transportation to provide access to Duluth, Green Bay, Chicago, and Sault Ste. Marie. The Ontario, Simcoe, and Huron Union Railway opened on January 1st, 1855. The financial crash of 1857 led to its reorganization as the Northern Railway of Canada in 1858. In this slide, we can see its locomotive, Josephine, in Collingwood in the 1870s. Ease of travel by ship encouraged growth of settlements on the eastern and northern shore of Georgian Bay that pursued prosperity through trade with smaller settlements and lumber camps. In addition to constructing a railway to Collingwood, funds were set aside to entice steamships to make regular runs to Collingwood, including tri-weekly runs to Chicago and the Soo and a weekly run to Green Bay. This view of Collingwood Harbour appeared in George Munro Grant's Picturesque Canada, the country as it is and was, that appeared in 1880. The woodcut captures the importance of maritime activity to the town's development. In the foreground are the rafts of logs brought from the inlets of Algoma and Parry Sound to feed Collingwood's thriving lumber business. Fishing boats under sail can be seen near the logs heading out of port. In the background to the right is a steamship, one of several passenger and freight vessels that connected settlements along the north shore of Georgian Bay. And to the left is a wooden grain elevator, which held the wheat, oats, and corn brought from Chicago and Duluth by schooner. At this point, schooners were more frequent in the harbor than steamships by a factor of about 14-1. The Pathfinder, one of the largest schooners to visit Collingwood in the 1880s, could carry 42,000 bushels of grain in one trip. Oh, there we go. The growth of settlement and trade brought to Georgian Bay by the railways provided an incentive to construct wooden boats to transport bulk cargo. The first boat built in Collingwood is reported to be the Brothers, a small schooner later fitted with a boiler and steam engine. Alfred Moir built the 1,000-ton barge Louis Hotchkiss, pictured here, in 1870 or 1871 for the Muskoka Mill and Lumber Company. Moir remained a fixture on the Collingwood waterfront, building wooden boats until his death in 1895. Everyone who owns a car will sooner or later need to visit a garage or body shop for regular inspections and maintenance, carry out repairs, or upgrade the vehicle. Ship owners are no different. Collisions with other vessels, docks, or canal lock gates, groundings due to storms or shifting lake and harbor bottoms, holes in hulls caused by underwater boulders, and shipboard fires required repairs in a facility where hulls could be exposed and supported. In order to secure an advantage in securing trade from the west that was passing through in greater volume each year to Toronto over Collingwood, its rival, its nemesis, one might say, the people of Owen Sound resolved to build a dry dock to repair lake vessels. Work began in 1875. This illustration from Grant's Picturesque Canada shows the rear of the Owen Sound Dry Dock Company's shipyard, operated by Captain John Simpson, which by 1880 had a reputation for building many of the staunchest steamers on the lakes. Not to be done by Owen Sound, perish the thought, citizens of Collingwood proposed to build a marine railway in August 1875. A bylaw was submitted to the town's ratepayers seeking approval to raise $50,000 through debentures to build the railway, which was rejected. After much angst and discussion, town officials backed a plan to lease property for the purpose of constructing a dry dock. Several leading citizens indicated their interest in forming a company to build the dock as soon as a suitable location was found, and an engineer was engaged in July 1880 to find the best spot on the Collingwood waterfront. According to the newspaper, the Enterprise and Collingwood Messenger, J.D. Silcox of Welland visited Collingwood in January 1882, looking for cedar to use in his contract for constructing the Murray Canal between the Bay of Quinte and Presqu'île Bay on Lake Ontario. The town's mayor drew his attention to the dry dock scheme discussed in council's previous session. Within a week, the meetings included shipbuilders Stephen Decatur Andrews of Port Robinson. Negotiations continued into February, when Owen Jones, engineer for the Northern Railway, was sent by the railroad to look after its interests. Now, Jones did not know anything about building dry docks, and since this was long before you could look up do-it-yourself videos on YouTube, he then set about to visit Buffalo, Detroit, and points along the Welland Canal to gather information about dry dock construction. Discussions went into the spring until a bylaw was introduced in May to provide the new dry dock company with a bonus of $25,000 to construct the facility. Perhaps swayed by the newspaper's constant reminders of the need to support the proposition that were sprinkled throughout the enterprise on June 8th, the ratepayers approved the proposal the next day by a vote of 304-8, a rather decisive victory for the dry dock proponents. And I especially like the last one, vote early and, well, as often as you can for the dry dock bylaw. Work began in July 1882 and continued into the following year with both Silcox and Andrews on site to supervise the project. After construction of a cofferdam in the harbor, scrapers removed earth and rock was blasted with explosives to create a dry dock that was 325 feet long and 60 feet wide. The facility was officially opened on May 24th, 1883, Queen Victoria's birthday. It was managed by Andrews, who tackled a steady stream of repair work to fix leaky hulls, replace lost wheels, which I discovered are actually propellers, and deal with the bottoms of boats that were worse for wear after pounding on rocks. While Silcox talked about building steel vessels in 1882, new builds at the dry dock were wooden. By May 1888, however, work at the dry dock was at a standstill. The property was described by the press as utterly worthless and driving business away from the town. Council sought a legal opinion from lawyers in Toronto to get out of the arrangement with Silcox, who was also keen to get the matter settled. According to the Enterprise, it was time to seize the day, and I quote, "It is of little use for us to fold our hands and wait for something to turn up. We are the architects of our own fortune. If we wish for an improvement in the present state of matters, we must take it. Again and again, it has been pointed out in these columns that we have advantages for certain kinds of manufacturing, such as cannot be elsewhere. If a number of our leading citizens who have a few hundred or a few thousand dollars to invest were to form a company for the promotion of any manufacturing interest that could profitably carried on here, success would certainly crown their attempt. Who will take the lead? A leader is what is required. The rest will follow." Into this void stepped Thomas and John Long. They were born in Limerick, Ireland. Thomas moved to Nottawa, a small community just south of Collingwood, in 1857, where he managed a general store for merchants before going into business for himself a year later. John joined his brother in the business in 1868. They built Collingwood's largest mercantile and wholesaling business and were directors of the Great Northern Transit Company, owners of the steamers Atlantic, Pacific, and Northern Belle. With the dry dock company declared insolvent, the Longs, along with Charles Cameron, entered into a 21-year lease with the town's council in March 1889 and retained S.D. Andrews to manage the yard that employed upwards of 150 men in building and repairing wooden boats. The Longs soon had aspirations to move into steel shipbuilding. In May 1892, John Long, acting in his role as president of the Collingwood Board of Trade, wrote to Captain Alexander McDougall, who had emigrated from Islay in the Scottish Highlands as a young lad and settled in Ottawa before taking to boats on the Great Lakes as a deckhand to escape the meager existence of farming. McDougall ascended to the rank of ship's master. He came up with the idea of whaleback boats with curved tops, straight sides and bottoms, and conical bows while towing a barge in heavy weather, and formed the American Steel Barge Company in West Superior, Wisconsin, to implement his design in 1888. It was Long's understanding, and I quote, "that it is your intention to start building some of your cigar or whaleback boats in some part of Ontario, and presuming if this be the case, and that there is no place you would prefer doing it so to Collingwood, which might always be considered your native town, I thought it would be well to write assuring you that the facilities are most favorable and that you would receive the greatest possible encouragement from the citizens of this place." McDougall replied a few days later, "I am glad to hear again from the old stamping ground," as he put it, "and when our company decides to locate a plant in Canada, I will be glad to consider Collingwood first among all places that might offer itself with equal inducements." Sounds like negotiating for free agents in sports. "At present, we are so busy organizing in England and putting in a large plant on the Pacific coast that I'm afraid we cannot give much attention to putting a plant in Canada." Moving past McDougall's rejection, the dry dock company continued with its core activity of ship repairs. Both Andrews and Alfred Morrill were also kept busy with orders for steam tugs from Collingwood's fishing fleet, which employed approximately 250 individuals. Vessels built by the Collingwood Dry Dock Company included the Fred A. Hodgson, with a length of 83.6 feet and a width of 16.75 feet, and the John J. Long, which was 97 feet in length and with a beam of 20 feet. Alfred Morrill was particularly busy in 1894, building 4 tugs with a workforce of 10 men. His work would be continued after his death in 1895 by his son, Robert. Collingwood's dry dock yard could undertake major projects after navigation season closed, which induced increasing numbers of vessels to winter in the port. The Bulletin newspaper reported in November 1893 that the growing interest in such services among ship owners was accompanied by the decline of Collingwood's rival, Owen Sound. The steamers City of Midland and tug Charlton were scheduled to be lengthened during the coming winter, giving employment to 100 men and causing the outlay of a large sum of money. The compounding of engines would keep the town's foundry taxed to its capacity. The newspaper boasted, and I quote, "It is evident that the Glasgow of Canada has moved slightly to the southeast along the shore of Georgian Bay. It is now firmly and permanently located in Collingwood. It is not ours to boast or to glory over a fallen rival, but we may be permitted to drop a silent tear over the buried boasting and braggadocio that have been for years called attention to empty vaporings of the town of Owen Sound. Its shipbuilding is forever gone, and when the Parry Sound Railway is completed, it will scarcely be heard of more. Its growth for a time was rapid, but its decay promises to be equally sudden." How dramatic. As Captain John Simpson's shipyard in Owen Sound fell quiet, the Dry Dock Company in Collingwood built the impressive wooden steamers Majestic in 1895 and Germanic in 1899, which were constructed in the dry dock and floated when complete. You'll notice with the slide on the screen now that there's also a boiler in the upper right-hand corner. This is a boiler from the John Inglis & Sons plant in Toronto. In fact, both boilers and marine engines came from Toronto, John Doty & Sons providing the marine engines. In the bottom right corner, you can see the very splendid dining room on board the Majestic. The Germanic was the last wooden hull built in the dry dock. You can see it under construction in this photograph. This is a nice view of it at the dock with a large crowd on board. And lastly, this lovely postcard from the Northern Navigation Company for the Germanic from the Collingwood Museum. By the end of the 19th century, profound changes were occurring on the Great Lakes that had a significant effect on Collingwood. The first was the rapid growth in the amount of grain being exported from Canada's western provinces and territories to eastern destinations due to the surge in crop yields from about 68 million bushels in 1900 to almost 1.5 billion bushels in 1917. This map of the Grand Trunk Railway system in 1903 shows the Georgian Bay ports competing for grain shipments in the early 20th century. It also highlights the central location of Collingwood, a feature that would be promoted during conversations with the Dominion government about dry dock locations. And if you can see my cursor on the screen, this of course is Collingwood down here. And the point that is often made by promoters of the dry dock is that in terms of the North Shore of Georgian Bay and its southern area as well, Collingwood was in a very central location. We've got Owen Sound to the left. We've got Wyerton further west. If you look to the east, we've got Penetanguishene and Midland and Parry Sound up in this area. And sorry, Parry Sound's right here. What always surprised me doing this work was the importance of Depot Harbour, which I think very few people have heard about in recent years. And at this point in 1904, receiving over 7 million bushels of grain compared to the 688,000, almost 689,000 that arrived in Collingwood. The second change was the construction of steel bulk carriers that got increasingly longer, wider, and deeper. The 1890s brought an increase in the length of these boats from 300 to 500 feet, as well as an increase in beam and depth. In January 1894, the Bulletin newspaper told its readers to prepare for the advent of boats more than 400 feet long, with a draft of 28 feet, far deeper than vessels that could be accommodated by Collingwood Harbour. And by 1899, Thomas Long was advocating for a significant increase to Canada's inland marine, with boats as large as American grain carriers to compete with the United States. On November 3, 1899, the Bulletin reported that quiet work was going on to establish a modern shipbuilding plant in Collingwood. Alexander McDougall's involvement with the Pacific Steel Barge Company ended in 1893, and he was preparing to sell the American Steel Barge Company in Superior. Working with John Long, they negotiated with Collingwood's council to create a shipyard that could build 4 canal-sized steel ships at once, or a single 500-foot vessel. The deal required a bonus of $50,000, which was put to the ratepayers for a vote. One often wonders, why would ratepayers support such a measure? Well, the Bulletin gave its view in an editorial published on November 17th that explained why there was an interest in building steel ships in Canada. The new shipyard would lead to an increase in population, resulting in increased rentals, new residential construction, and the growth in the property tax base. The employment of highly skilled workers would lead to large sums of money paid in wages, which would circulate in the town and benefit every business. As shipping increased, other manufacturers would follow. The bylaw was almost unanimously approved in December 1899. The new shipyard required a much larger dry dock. Since 1892, the Dominion government offered subsidies of 2% on the cost of a dry dock for 20 years, the cost of building a dry dock for 20 years to encourage their construction, and the offer was enhanced in August 1899 to reflect the rising cost of building larger facilities. The new company formed by the Long brothers and McDougall submitted its petition for a subsidy on December 20th, 1900. They argued that the dry dock built in 1883 at a cost of $70,000 with no public funds had outlived its usefulness. A much larger class of vessel than those previously employed has become necessary for the grain and iron ore trades, and that it was in the public interest to build Canadian vessels of a larger size that could compete with the vessels of the United States. It was also important that dockage of such vessels should be established at a Canadian port so that repairs can be done in Canada and not lose a substantial amount of work and revenues to ports in the United States. Collingwood offered a fully equipped steel shipyard on a large and commodious harbor that was centrally located on the Upper Lakes, but it required a new dry dock that would cost $20,000 to build a structure 425 to 500 feet long, 75 to 80 feet wide, and 16 to 20 feet deep. This drawing, which accompanied the petition from the company, shows the company's ambitious plans for their shipyard. 3 dry docks and a launching slip would be bordered by 6 building berths with traveling overhead cranes. This drawing is from one of the Department of Public Works files at Library and Archives Canada. At the bottom of that drawing was a cross-section that gives a different perspective on the configuration. 2 of the dry docks have single rows of keel blocks. You can see one here and one there. The middle dry dock is intended for doubling up the vessels. You can see the 2 rows of keel blocks here. To the far left is the launching slip. The overhead cranes, essential features for any shipyard moving steel plate and frames, are also recognizable, and you can see them in this row across the top here. This drawing from the Department of Public Works central file on the Collingwood dry dock shows the important elements of its construction. The floor is thick with reinforcement under the keel blocks right here, which supports most of the vessel's weight. The walls were to be constructed of limestone or sandstone, tapering from the base to ground level. The width of the dock narrowed from 78 feet at the top to 60 feet across the bottom. You can see the measurements sent out here. As with most projects, time led to creep in the project scope and cost. The principal concern of Sir Wilfrid Laurier's cabinet ministers was the dry dock as proposed was not long enough to accommodate the Upper Lake's longest vessels. The design was lengthened to 530 feet at the request of the Dominion government, with more substantial walls and a thicker floor than originally planned. These changes led to the company increasing its budget to $500,000 from $200,000 in March 1902 and to ask for greater financial assistance. The Dominion government agreed and increased the subsidy from 2 to 3% in a legislative amendment that received assent on August 13, 1903. The company would receive an annual subsidy of $15,000 for 20 years from the Dominion government. The new company quickly got to work. This photograph, which appeared in the promotional booklet Collingwood, the Gem of the Georgian Bay, that was published in 1906, shows the dry dock under construction. The Queen's dry dock was removed and replaced with a much longer, wider, and more substantial facility. A coffer dam was built to protect the site from the harbor's water, allowing excavation and stone and concrete masonry to set. Really difficult to see in this photograph. We're looking towards the harbor with the grain elevator in the background. The coffer dam would be approximately in this location. It would be a timber cribbing with stone, I believe, that was used by the construction company to create a water barrier so that they would have dry property to work with while they were excavating the soil, removing rock, and also pouring cement and dealing with the limestone and sandstone masonry. By the end of December 1903, the canalers A.E. Ames and Turok Crown were undergoing substantial repairs in the new dry dock. This photograph shows the Saronic and Otonabee on the keel blocks for repairs, braced along their hulls to prevent rolling over. The bulk carrier Collingwood, 406 feet long, can be seen under construction on the dock wall. Collingwood Harbour may have been large and commodious, as the petitioners put it, but it was not deep. Town Council and the Board of Trade had lobbied the Dominion government for funding to dredge the harbour and create a channel 20 feet deep since the 1880s, with varying degrees of success, often dependent upon politics and the lobbying of their member of parliament. Basically, the financial pie was finite, and it became a process of lobbying for different sized pieces of that pie against communities such as Owen Sound and Midland. This plan from Library and Archives Canada shows only 11 or 12 feet of water at the dry dock's gate in 1893, making it impossible to accommodate the larger boats of the Upper Lakes. Pleas for dredging increased after the approval of the dry dock project, since new boats being built by the company could not gain access to the harbor. There would be no return on the investment in the company and the dry dock without dredging. This photograph shows the dredge Kingsford and its barge in front of the dry dock around 1904. The constant need for dredging would be a constant concern, particularly since large bulk carriers would occasionally run aground in the harbor, much to the concern of vessel owners. It always goes over badly for the company when, while on the way to get your vessel repaired, you cause greater damage to it. One of the greatest challenges that made it difficult to create an ever deeper navigable waterway was the composition of the harbor bed. More than 10% of the material to be removed was stone or boulders, which required drilling and blasting. This photograph, taken in September 1910, shows some of the boulders removed from the ship channel in Collingwood Harbour, including one that was 7.5 feet high, 6.5 feet across, and 4.5 feet deep. It is easy to imagine the damage that a rock of this heft and shape could inflict upon the bottom of a steel boat, leading to the expensive replacement of plates and rivets. Not a very good quality image. This is from the files, the dredging files for the Department of Public Works. You can see a lot of silvering to the right of the image, but it is noteworthy for showing a diver in his dry suit here with a hard hat and the size of this rather large boulder that they would have had to extricate from the bottom of the harbor. There was also much activity on shore. Hugh Calderwood, who had worked for Alexander McDougall in West Superior's American Steel Barge Company, was hired as manager in February 1900. McDougall was able to purchase the complete Pacific Steel Barge plant in Everett, Washington, to outfit the yard. 9 rail cars full of heavy equipment arrived in April 1900 for use in the new molding loft and punch shop. The next few slides provide a good overview of the buildings and machinery that was in place by 1907. The original images are located at Library and Archives Canada, either as attachments to a letter sent by Calderwood's successor, James Smith, to Wilfrid Laurier in 1908, or as part of an album on steel shipbuilding in Canada, created in 1913, but as part of the National Library collection. All of these images have been scanned now, and my assumption is that they will soon be available for searching within LAC's online catalog. So this photograph shows the punch shop, where the framing and plating for ships is finished, so that they are ready for placing on the ships. So note the rails running through the middle of the shop so that heavy steel can be brought in. The traveling overhead crane to move steel is at the back. You can see it here with more chains for lifting throughout the shop. Ship's plate piled up here, and I believe to the right, this is likely a ship's frame. So what would happen in this shop is literally punching holes in the steel. These massive pieces of machinery would be used to create the openings that would be used for riveting the plates onto the ship and riveting the frames together as well. I should point out that in these days there was no ear protection, and so hearing loss was an occupational hazard for people working in the shipyard. I would imagine too that some of this equipment, perhaps the presses or the punches that you can see here, would have come from the Everett shipyard in Washington. Next is the boiler shop. As you can tell, and I assume that there's proof in advertising, this is the biggest boiler ever made in Canada with a weight of 65 tons. What gives it some sense of scale is in the bottom here, you can see a riveter at work on the back head of the boiler. And when you look at his size compared to the boiler itself, it gives you some idea of the enormity of this machinery that would go on board ship to power the marine engines. This is the foundry where castings for ships and engines are made. Foundries are notoriously dirty places because of the sand that would have to be used for making castings. It was a difficult place to work and would be very noisy as well. These are all around February 1907, by the way. And this is the sort of thing that gets produced. This is a propeller wheel, 14 tons. And it's always useful when you've got people in the photograph to give you some idea of the scale of this equipment. Next, we have the engine works, or machine shop, where the propelling machinery, otherwise known as marine engines, is completed and ready to fit on board the ship. I didn't mean to do that. Apologies. Meredith, are we back to where we should be?
Yep. Yeah, we're back to, well, I think so. Yeah, this is
Yeah,
where we were. Yeah.
I clicked on the wrong button and stopped sharing instead of reactivating my microphone.
Yep. No, we're at the right picture. Yeah.
Good.
Perfect.
And so next is an 800 horsepower triple expansion marine engine. So the idea of triple expansion is that as the steam would be exhausted from one cylinder, it would go into another cylinder where yet more energy would be extracted from the steam. So the boilers are producing the steam going into the engines, and this is what's driving the pistons that turn the crankshaft that turn the propeller. All right, and now we have the launch of the Midland Prince. Collingwood shipyard would build its first 500-footer, the Emperor, in 1910. But in the meantime, on December 5th, 1906, we had the launch of the Midland Prince, which was pretty long at 486 feet, with a beam or width of 55 feet and a depth of 31 feet. So when you realize that these vessels are now having a draft of 31 feet, you recognize that the 11 or 12 feet that was originally at the gate of the dry dock would have been totally insufficient. A couple of things I'd like to point out. One are the chains that are used to stop the sideways motion of the boat as it hits dry dock number 1. And so they would have filled up the dry dock and opened the gate and then launched the vessel, and to make sure it didn't hit the far wall and cause significant damage to the hull, they would use these chains to arrest its movement. I also like the fact that there's this large crowd that's gathered to watch the launch at the bottom. When I worked at the Toronto Harbour Commission at the beginning of my career, I was really very much aware that waterfront industries are industries that the public have no knowledge of. They never interact with the public, and the waterfront seemed to be the city's backyard where you hide industries like coal storage and what have you, oil tanks, scrapyards that you don't want the public to really be aware of. Shipbuilding, on the other hand, was very connected with the community, and the launches became great ceremonies of public engagement, a tradition that continued up into the 1980s in Collingwood, and were occasions to be remembered. And after the launch, of course, is when you install the boiler and the marine engine. Both boilers and marine engines were very heavy, and it made the launch go smoother if you didn't have all that weight, coupled with the energy of the boat going down the ways and hitting the water. Far better that you install these after the launch, so the weight is added after the fact. And this is a good photograph of it actually, of a marine engine actually in place on board ship. I think this is the Midland Prince, and this is in April 1907. As early as 1901, Alexander McDougall had called upon the Dominion government to subsidize the construction of new steel vessels so that Canadian shipbuilders could be on an even playing field with their competitors, particularly those in Britain. In March 1902, John Long joined shipbuilders from Toronto to meet with Laurier and other cabinet ministers to discuss such a subsidy. And while the discussions were encouraging, nothing came of the lobbying. In February 1908, Leighton McCarthy, the Member of Parliament for Simcoe, including the Collingwood shipyard, wrote to Laurier urging his government to subsidize steel shipbuilding so that he could strengthen his political standing in Collingwood. Laurier refused, citing temporary subsidies to Canadian steel interests that persisted far longer than planned. Instead, Laurier's government offered two legislative initiatives to support steel shipbuilding. The first was a 25% tariff on repairs to Canadian vessels in American ports to encourage these vessels to cross the border for such work. And it should be noted that the U.S. tariff on repairs done to American boats in Canadian ports was 50%. Secondly, the government passed yet another act to encourage the construction of dry docks, making the subsidy even sweeter than in 1903. Alexander McDougall, the president of shipbuilding after John Long's death in 1904, successfully petitioned the Dominion government for a second dry dock subsidy, which led to the construction of Dry Dock 2 in 1909. Although it was only 420 feet long, it was 140 feet wide at the coping level, which is the top of the dry dock, and 100 feet across the bottom, accommodating two large boats abreast, as can be seen in this image from Library and Archives Canada. The company's two dry docks could be lengthened to 600 feet, and a third one added if the Dominion government approved the long-sought subsidy on the construction of new tonnage. McDougall was very explicit about this. Further growth would depend upon that subsidy. If you think back to the earlier slide showing the plan submitted with Collingwood Shipbuilding's petition for a dry dock subsidy in 1900, you will recall that it showed 3 dry docks and a launching slip as the company's grand design. You can see that still in place in 1914. Dry dock 1 is down here. Dry dock 2, this is the proposed large dry dock, which would be 600 feet or greater, and this was supposed to be the launching slip. You can see the dotted lines here that show the proposed configuration for the shoreline. Alas, the subsidy was never forthcoming, and Canadian shipyards were soon overtaken by wartime shipbuilding programs. By 1917, thoughts of a third dry dock and launching slip disappeared from the paper trail. This also is from Library and Archives Canada's files for the Department of Public Works. And all that we have now are the 2 dry docks, with no mention of what was to be done here. It is worth pointing out, however, that this is the location of Watt's Boathouse, very noteworthy at Collingwood Museum for its artifacts left from the boat building business in Collingwood. So to me, the final piece in this story is the appointment of John Shearer Leach, master shipbuilder, as he was referred to in the literature at the time. Collingwood thrived under the leadership of Leach. Born in 1880 in New York City, he learned the shipbuilding trade at Glasgow and Newcastle on Tyne, and graduated with honours in naval architecture from South Kensington, which is now Imperial College, London. After apprenticing as a shipbuilder and draftsman, he was put in charge of the drafting room at Workman, Clark and Company, Belfast, and was appointed the company's assistant manager in 1911. He emigrated to Canada the following year, taking up the position of managing director at Collingwood and serving in that position until he retired in 1946. He stayed in Collingwood until his death in 1962 at the age of 83. I should point out, by the way, that during the Second World War, John Shearer Leach actually managed 4 shipyards that were owned by Collingwood shipyards: Port Arthur, Collingwood, Midland, and Kingston. Collingwood's shipyard remained busy throughout his early years, using the dry docks for a steady stream of repairs and the adjoining property to build canalers such as the Keystone, bulk carriers such as the James Carruthers, the J.H.G. Haggerty, and the Westmount, bucket dredges for the federal government, a passenger and car ferry for service between Windsor and Pelee Island, and 5 tankers for the Imperial Oil Company. In the 6 years that followed Leach's arrival, the yard produced 12 vessels with a total capacity of 36,761 gross tons. The contracts for the last 2 tankers were rather prescient. They included the requirement that the vessels be ocean-going, capable of doing 9 knots with a $1,000 bonus for every quarter of a knot up to 10, a speed thought to be minimum to outrun submarines. In conclusion, the pursuit of capacity to build and repair ships, or boats as they are called on the Great Lakes, was the collaborative effort of Collingwood's business community expressed through Town Council and the Board of Trade. John and Thomas Long emerged as the leaders of the movement. They were wholesale merchants whose interest in trade led to an involvement in the business of shipping, including vessel ownership. If one is going to own boats, you also need to repair and replace them. The dynamics of these businesses changed in the 1890s as the trade in grain and iron ore and imports of coal to fuel colonial settlement in the Upper Lakes and the Canadian Northwest led to the adoption of steel and significant increases in the vessel length, width, and depth. Locally, the Longs and their colleagues were determined that the money to be made from building and repairing these steel freshwater whales and to moving bulk cargoes should not fall entirely to the Americans. There are opportunities for Canadian entrepreneurs to enter these markets, and the Dominion government, under Wilfrid Laurier, agreed that it was in the public interest. Little did they know that they would create a foundation for steel shipbuilding that would play a significant role in Canada's response to the shipping crises of 2 world wars. That's all there is. There isn't any more. Thank you very much.
Well, that was quite a lot. So that was fantastic. That was a lot of information. Thank you. And it's very very enlightening, all the work that had to be done to create all of that. So yeah, so now we have the question and answer period. So is there anybody here that has any questions for Michael?
And a hush fell over the crowd.
I actually have a question. So you had stated that they wanted to kind of get the grants so that they could expand to be on par with like the British shipyards. So I was wondering, like, what was the difference between the two? Like, what was the scale of like Collingwood's or Canada's compared to theirs?
I think the biggest difference was wage rates, and that labor in Britain was at least 25 to 30% cheaper. Britain also had a very well-established system of apprenticeship. And so basically, when a young person joined a shipyard, they worked almost for free for 5 years, which, according to Alexander McDougall, who published a pamphlet on this issue in 1907, really gave the British shipyards a competitive edge. The other thing that they were trying to avoid as well were Canadian ship owners going down to the States and buying secondhand vessels from American owners at a greatly reduced price. And in order to get more support for the shipyard, they then put in that tariff on ship repairs. And I think that there might have been other provisions about American boats as well, which really made the ship owners quite unhappy. And I think numerically speaking, there are far more ship owners than there were shipbuilders. And so when you've got 2 opposing parties lobbying the Dominion government, usually there is some strength in numbers. And you can cry louder if you have more people arguing your case than if you're just a few steel shipbuilders. You know, the contingent that went up in 1902 to talk to Laurier, I think there might have been only 3 or 4 of them. There was Bertram from Toronto, Redway from Toronto, Long from Collingwood. There might have been a 4th one as well, but relatively small in numbers. And steel shipbuilding, you know, up to 1905 was really very much in its infancy in Canada. It was still trying to get established.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you. I see that Lindsay has a question. So Lindsay, you can feel free to unmute yourself.
Oh, hi.
Hi, Lindsay.
Hi. So I think I have a comment and a question. My mind is actually blown. That was the first time I got to see the Long Brothers proposal to the Dominion government. So understanding that there was a third dry dock that was proposed, and then a proposed slip on top of that, launching slip, is just like, what? So I'll be it's just wonderful to be able to listen to your talk and learn these new things. I just wanted to confirm the dates that Leach and Collingwood shipyards kind of began managing the Midland, Kingston, and Port Arthur. Those shipyards. What were those dates?
So Kingston, I can't remember if it was 1910 or a little bit later that Kingston was taken over.
Okay.
And Port Arthur, it's 1926 that Port Arthur is taken over and is officially known as Collingwood Shipyards. And Midland, I'm not sure of the date, but at this point, Canada's Steamship Lines was acquiring a number of shipyards in order to have the capacity to build and repair its own vessels. And that process was really led by Joseph Norcross and Roy Wolven. So the other one part of the story I didn't talk about is that in 1916, it's Norcross and Wolven who buy the Collingwood shipbuilding plant, and they become part of a CSL conglomerate, and it's no longer really led by local investors. So the days of Long and I think Charles Cameron and the Board of Trade and the council, seeing this as a local initiative, instead it becomes very much a part of a company that's based in Montreal and part of this grander scheme of the Canada Steamship Lines. Wolven and Norcross had also tried to buy the Port Arthur Shipbuilding Company in 1916, and they failed. And they weren't able to get the company until 1926. And so it's at that point, I think, that Port Arthur falls under Leach's control and CSL's influence. And, I should add as well that, the 1908 legislation, particularly the one to encourage the construction of dry docks, it was really driven by McCarthy's desire to win the support of Collingwood, the town and the company. And its inadvertent result was that's what led to the Port Arthur Shipbuilding Company being started as a branch plant of the American Shipbuilding Company in Cleveland, was because of this 1908 Act. It also led to the dry dock being built in Prince Rupert, British Columbia. So that act had rather large, long-reaching effects. And the irony is that McCarthy ended up leaving politics anyways because he didn't get the support of the company. So it's an interesting story from that point of view. And at times, when you look at the early 2000s, it was Stephen Harper who started the National Shipbuilding procurement strategy, which was then carried on by Justin Trudeau. And so many of the arguments that were being used in the early years are still being heard today. The idea of the need for skilled labor and the need to have the Dominion or federal government subsidize the construction of ships, that industry, there are a number of spin-off industries that benefit, and you get this highly skilled workforce and you get higher wages and you help support a burgeoning population. A lot of those arguments that the Bulletin was making in the early 1900s, you end up hearing a century later in Canada when we talk about a national shipbuilding program.
Perfect. Thank you. We also
Thank
have
you.
sorry. We also have a comment from Walter. So Walter said the Kingston shipyards is 1910. They took over the government dry dock there.
Thank you, Walter.
Does anybody else have any other questions? So I actually do have another question. Naturally, I'm always full of questions, but my question for you is, when you were doing the research, was there something that you just found that you were just like, oh my goodness, like you never knew that it was that way, or was everything kind of just how you thought it was going to play out?
Oh, there are all sorts of surprises along the way. Like Lindsay, I was surprised to find out that they were actually planning a third dry dock, one that was over 600 feet long. And I was surprised at, I was really surprised when I found that letter from Leighton McCarthy to Wilfrid Laurier, that, you know, quite often you come across legislation and you wonder what inspired it. You know, what led to a bill being proposed, an act being passed. And I really didn't understand the background to yet another act to encourage the construction of dry docks until I came across this letter from Leighton McCarthy and explaining his political difficulties in Collingwood and how he needs Laurier's support. And so things then started to fall into place a little bit more. There are a couple of more rabbit holes that I need to go down. The whole story of the campaign for a steel shipbuilding subsidy is one that requires a bit more study, I think. I am going up to the Simcoe County Archives tomorrow and next week to look at issues of the 1870s. I'd started working with Matthew Alexander and Isabel Blake looking at the Collingwood newspapers from the 1880s. Now, the ones from the 1870s are not available in the same run as what they are after 1882. But, you know, I did discover through the Globe's online newspapers, through York University libraries, that the story actually goes back to 1875. So I'm hoping going up to Simcoe County Archives and looking at town records, I'll get a better understanding of what was going on in the 1870s.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you. I always find with historical research or anything like that, one of my favorite things is to look into the sources because sometimes you don't know where you're going to find really valuable information. So, like the letter, for instance, was a lot, and as you said, it had so many photos included that are just really valuable.
Yeah.
So that's really cool. Yeah. Does anybody have any other questions? Well, I'm not going to keep bothering you, Michael, with my multitude of questions. But I'd like to thank you. So on behalf of myself and the Simcoe County Museum, I'd like to thank you for your presentation. I actually didn't know lots about dry docks before this, and I feel like I do know more now. So I really appreciate that. That information is definitely invaluable. So thank you very much. For everybody that's joining me, we do have one more presentation next Thursday at 1 o'clock. So please feel free to join us then. And if you want to see this presentation again, we will be posting it on our website. So we like to post it within a week of the presentation. So thank you everybody for joining me and have a lovely day.
Thank you, Meredith.
Thank you.